her evergreen faculty were extremely helpful. I've watched those same faculty members talking to other students. After Rachel went, I remember this summer when there were like 40 or 50 students who wanted to make the same trip. And the faculty was extremely careful and cautious and all of us, you know, in explaining what this was about and what you needed to think about. Evergreen is going to, I believe, install, after 10 years, a memorial to Rachel this fall. It's a very, even there, where there's tremendous support for her, there are still some who are, because of their connections to Israel, their strong feeling about Israel, you know, have challenged that along the way, but there is support for her there. Our community, we have the Rachel Corrie Foundation based in Olympia. Olympia was the first community. We have the Olympia Food Co-op that is boycotting Israeli products, and that's very controversial. But looking at South Africa, it's a path that economic impact had a positive result ultimately. And actually, we're guided by friends in Israel, like Who Profits and organizations there that are saying we can't do this alone. We can't solve these problems alone. We need things to be happening in the U.S. who are supportive of what Olympia Food Co-op did. But I'm just trying to give you a picture of the community. We struggle a lot in that community, but it's a very rich and alive community where much is happening around this issue and where Rachel is very much remembered. There's a little cafe called Traditions Cafe where all of us go when speakers come to town, and there's lots of good music and stuff. To this day, for over 10 years, Rachel's photo, a poster of her that appeared on the day she was killed. The Iraq War was about to start. There was a rally happening in Olympia that night, and it turned into a vigil really for Rachel with many, many people. Craig and I not there, we were in North Carolina at the time, but coming to remember her, and this poster appeared very, very quickly, and there's still a copy of it in the window when you walk into Traditions Cafe. So I'd say that we're, not by everyone, but her story is embraced by the community and college.
We have time, like a couple more questions. Yeah. Here.
Cindy and Craig, I'm disappointed that the court in Israel didn't rule in your favor. Have you gotten any expressions of empathy from anyone in the Israeli government?
Right after Rachel was killed, as Cindy said, we were living in North Carolina, but our son was at that time, our son now is just right over here in Avon. He just moved there a few weeks ago, but at that time he's in the DC area. We flew up to be with him that night, and the Consul General from Israel to the Western United States called and got my son. He thought he was talking to me, but he gave his condolences. But we later that summer happened to be in San Francisco and met with him, really about sort of a related matter. But when he met with us, then he was strangely went out of his way to say, you know, when I gave my condolences, that was not for my government, that was personal. Mm-hmm. I thought, wait a minute, you know, you're an ambassador type, you're not supposed to do anything personal. And then to come out and point out that it wasn't, you know, make it clear it wasn't coming from his government. That was pretty strange. I think we had some contact. My daughter, Sarah, wrote a letter. We were trying to get a U.S. investigation in because, again, a thorough, credible, and transparent investigation was promised by Sharon, Prime Minister Sharon, to President Bush the day after Rachel was killed. And it's, like Cindy said, our government says that's never happened. So somebody in Congress, a staffer, said, have you ever asked Sharon? You know, you're asking the U.S. government. And I said, well, you know, if the President of the United States can't get him to do it, I don't think we could. But our daughter Sarah wrote a letter to Sharon, and our congressman was going over there, and her congressman, and took it. And I think in that letter he said something about, I'm sorry about your daughter. But of course, we didn't do anything wrong. You know,
a response.
There was a response to that. So if you want to take that. But the only thing that I thought was real was, well, that one, and then also in trying to go, our first trip to Gaza, when we were going over there, wanted to meet. I think through what you were saying, you know, you can see from what Rachel was doing that the people in Rafah, she had this incredible connection with them. They were taking care of her, and it was amazing. But those of you from Rafah or Palestinians sort of know, I wanted to thank the people of Rafah. When I couldn't be a father to Rachel, they were. Those people were. And so we went, but it took us 6 months to get there. And we had met with the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, and he had said to us, if you ever come to Israel, give me a call, like he's going to be, I don't know.
Not the Prime Minister, the ambassador.
The ambassador, yeah, the ambassador, thank you. Yeah, like he's going to be a tour guide or something. And so then when we got ready to go, I called this office and just said to secretary, I don't need to speak to him, but he did say this. I said, the one thing he can do for us is get us into Gaza. And a guy called back, Alan Yashpiz, and he asked if it was me, and then he choked up. And so I think there was some real feeling there. He didn't get us into Gaza. Our government finally did. You know, so I think there's some feeling people, and I'm glad they're in their government. But then there's a lot of just some horrible out of the lawsuit, the reaction in the court by the military, by a lot of other people. Their word, I think I once said, you know, somehow in English, the translation of Palestinian is terrorist. That's the word they always use, you know. And I just can't imagine if you were in a U.S. court using something that prejudicial over and over again with it never being questioned. You know, it's weird.
I just want to add that in the court, one thing, I mean, some of the most stunning things is that the military person who wrote the manual for how these large pieces of equipment should be used in the military testified under oath that it was his belief that there were no civilians in war. Completely counter to international law. And that this is a colonel in the U.S. military. And
Not
so,
U.S.
Or I mean in the Israeli military. So what the trial was for us was a window into that mentality, at least presented by the folks that we heard from. The deputy, or the person who was the lead investigator, who in our estimation did a very poor investigation. But he said he believed that they were at war in Gaza with everyone, including the children and the peace activists specifically. So again, that was somebody who was, you know, according to the U.S., was supposed to then be able to conduct a fair investigation of the situation, and yet that was his mentality. There are many, many examples of that. But I also want to share with you, because Craig and I really lived in Israel for about 9 or 10 months during this whole trial process, starting in 2010 through 2012. And the courtroom wasn't an enormous courtroom. So on big days when there were significant witnesses, they were all significant to us, but some were more significant to the press and the public. And when that happened, our Israeli supporters came, and I think about Yonatan Shapiro, who stood outside the courtroom. He was in the military. He refused to fly. He was an Air Force pilot in the military, and some years before had refused to fly missions over the West Bank in Gaza. That ruins his career as a pilot in Israel. But he was outside the court, even though there wasn't room for him inside, just because he wanted to be there for us. And there are many, many others like that, and many people, in many ways, Jewish Israelis, Palestinian Israelis, Palestinians, of course, from all over the world, who have lent support to us. So I just want to make sure you have that picture of things as well.
Okay, this is going to be... Sorry, what was the question?
The question was, did we ever meet the person that drove the bulldozer?
Was he at the court?
He came to court, but for several, basically for that soldier, the soldiers that were in the bulldozers, they used a screen so that we could not see him. You could hear his voice, but of course we can't understand his words. So we're hearing the translations that our basic, really Jewish Israeli friends are giving us.
From Hebrew to English.
Yeah, from Hebrew to English. So no, we couldn't meet him. We're not allowed to use his name publicly by the court. You know, there was the government of Israel really tried to clamp down on a lot of information. We have a whole lot of that information, sort of funny enough, but it's not allowed to be used in public. And as Cindy says, this soldier, when you talk about justice or something, I don't know what justice would look like. I look to actually to what the play was about, which we saw last night, and you all should go to Brown or to New York to see it. But out of South Africa and the feeling of justice that they finally came to there, of restorative justice, the only thing I can think of is you have to somehow get together and put your community back together when it's been ripped apart like this. I don't know how you do that in Israel and Palestine, but if they can take a shot at it in South Africa, you can work on it anywhere. But I have no idea even where I was going with that. It doesn't matter. It would have been a long story. And not all that good.
So we're gonna have a couple more questions, and now I'm gonna so while you're still here and captivated, we're gonna pass this hat that Ashley wore in the show, and just to let you know that absolutely through the grace of the Peace Studies Program, International Studies, the Center for International Education, the Theater Department, blah 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 blah. Anybody else? That's right, it's Sadhu here, who spread the gospel around. So all of the money that we gather here will go to support these guys at the Freedom Theater. And so if you could, we'll just start over here, just give her the hat. Yeah, and but please stick around, we can talk for a few more minutes.
Of international law and UN resolutions. Israel maintains the administrative detention system from the British Mandate, which means that any Palestinian can be arrested and imprisoned for up to 6 months without due process. Indeed, they could be put into prison for up to 6 months, and the only justification needs to be in military court, represented by a representative of the military, to explain the arrest and the incarceration without charge, without family, and without representation, or the arrestee being in attendance. At the end of 6 months, it can be extended another 6 months. And there have been several members of the Freedom Theater arrested since Giuliano's death, one of which who was arrested fairly recently, a year ago, under the administrative detention law and spent 6 weeks in prison. I think the total numbers, if I'm not mistaken, the total number is well over 200,000. Between 200,000 and 400,000 Palestinians have served some kind of imprisonment since the early 90s. It's an enormous number, and for very long terms. I have 2 very close friends who spent between 7 and 9 years in prison for being members of political parties. One guy who's now the accountant for the Theater Day Productions, which is a huge youth theater in Gaza City run by Jan Willems and Jackie Lubeck. And Francis, his name is Francis, and he likes to tell the story that he got 9 years in prison as opposed to 7 in the early 90s because he was a Christian. And they tended to give the Christians harder sentences. But he also, while he was in prison, got his master's from the University of Pennsylvania in accounting.
Anybody else?
One more.
Now, is there a different version of, I think I saw one of it was Rachel's Words, I think that was the title of it. And it was like a basic,
Is there another?
with the play about Rachel Corrie. I saw a version 5-6 years ago. It was done by 2 young women. Basically, they were reading from a 3-ring binder, but it was all her emails.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
that it did not seem as intensely personal. This one was, you see, the more the internal struggle of Rachel being like being in a safe home in Washington State versus risking her life in Palestine.
I don't know if I'm going to answer it or not, but initially what came out were Rachel's emails from Gaza that went to our family and to friends and people that she was trying to share this with, because she went to be a witness.
Right.
And those emails had such an impact on us personally, because we knew she was always a writer all her life. She was one of those little kids that always would be sitting in the corner drawing or writing, and that's why we had tubs of things that I couldn't bear to part with, you know, and so we went through and pulled out what we could use of those, or somebody could. But with those emails, I had read, actually I told you about the documentary films that she showed me, and I always feel bad. There was one, it was on checkpoints, and I watched it, you know, but I was so removed from that. And she said, "What do you think?" You know, and I had sort of kind of a non-reaction, not a real strong reaction. And then in 2003, I went through, it's very different today, but I went through a checkpoint, Kalandia checkpoint. It wasn't a particularly bad day there. There were a lot of bad days at those checkpoints. They were pulling young men out to the side and questioning and so forth. But I was just in this line going through an area, it seemed like about the size of this room, packed with Palestinian families. There was a father holding onto his little girl's hand, and Hijleh Arif, a very significant Palestinian activist, was with me. And as we walked through, I remembered the documentary film and how it took me being in that checkpoint under those circumstances for me to really integrate what it was, even though films are so important and powerful, what I had seen there. And I started crying because I was remembering Rachel. And the man ahead of me holding on to his little girl's hand just turned to me and he said, "This is the occupation." And of course it is, and that's one thing that Americans don't have a very good sense of. I don't even think now, is that while we might hear about occasional attacks and that sort of thing, we didn't hear about the moment-to-moment, day-to-day, every single day of their lives. For most people, most Palestinians, many 60-some years of this kind of in one way or another, we don't know about that. So those emails were so significant. And I said to my son, Chris, at one time, "What do you think?" And he said, and he's living in Washington, D.C. He's the Yale graduate in the family that she jokes about. I said, "What do you think about this?" He says, "It's a perspective I do not hear." And when Rachel was killed, a cousin called on the phone like within an hour. And Craig and I, it's a whole story about how we learned. And you can imagine that that was the worst hour and day of our lives. And but this cousin called and he said, "I just needed to hear your voices and just say how sorry I am." And I said to him, "We have to get her words out." And the reason was because she had gone there to be a witness, and she had given my number in that funny scene in the play to the Olympian, because we had lived in that community for many years and I had been active in the community, and she thought they'd maybe run a human interest story about her being in Palestine. They never did until after, you know, they did, then they wrote about her. And I saw that it was impacting all of our family, what she had to say. So that thing of having to get our words out, we sent the emails that she had sent to our family, and then within a very short time got word from the Guardian saying, "We'd like to use some," and then the next day, we haven't seen anything that so humanizes the situation in Gaza. We want to print the whole thing, which you can still go to the Guardian online and see over 2 days the email exchanges, a couple exchanges with the one with Craig, but also what she sent to us. So some people still, because we've made them public, will read those emails in different ways. And then there's the other writing that comes from the play, of course. And there's a somewhat longer version of the play. I thought you did a wonderful job with
It was
what
really
you
hard
included.
to choose.
Yeah, but it's, so it's, you may hear different things coming from different people.